Welcome, my name is Lars Haider and I'm happy to report that the number of listeners to this podcast is growing all the time, and I think we could set a new record today as I have two men sat with me here from a company that everyone knows. That company is Engel and Völkers. Let's just say one of the most important property brokerage companies in the world. If these two gentlemen now disagree with me on that, then I have a problem.
No, we won't.
Just to throw some numbers out there, 800 locations in 30 countries. Perhaps it's even more by now. 12,000 people working for the brand, yes, and of course everyone associates Engel and Völkers with Christian Völkers, one of the two gentlemen who's here. But he hasn't come alone, and we'll be going into why he hasn't come alone. The other gentleman is Sven Odia. Both of them are CEOs, co-chairman of the management board. Equal, not equal, we'll be talking about that in due course too. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. Preparing for this talk, I found out many great things about you and at least one incredible statement made by Mr. Völkers, and we want to talk about that. But before we start, as the two of you are here after all, perhaps Mr. Odia, you could start by telling our listeners what they need to know about Christian Völkers.
What does one need to know about Christian Völkers? Well, I've known Christian Völkers for almost 23 years now. And I don't think I know anyone else who has remained so true to themselves in those 23 years. What has always distinguished him is his willpower and incredible optimism. Things that aren't working, that's not accepted. There are no limitations. The same question is always asked: how can it work? What has to happen to make it work? And I believe that this persistence that he's shown not only in the 22, 23 years I've known him, but over 40 years, to make Engel and Völkers something very special, something extraordinary. That is absolutely what sets him apart. And to retain his human side at the same time, as the saying goes in Hamburg, being a feiner Kerl, a good fellow that people can completely rely on, where work is not always the sole focus, but also the bond of friendship, of partnership. I think that's something quite special, and that's how I describe him in short.
When word got around in our editorial office that Christian Völkers would be coming, the women all got talking. I don't know if there's a right way to put this. They got talking about how old he is. And then, of course, we did some research, and there was really, I'm not just saying this because you sat here, but absolute amazement that you're already a little past 60, correct?
Yes, I'm 63, that's right.
63, that's somehow, well, it fits with your young. He's kept young.
Christian is someone for me who's always remained young and is always active. As I mentioned, I don't just see him at work here in our office in Hamburg or abroad, but also privately during the holidays, and there's just no stopping him.
Privately on holiday? Meaning you don't just work together, you also spend your holidays together on the whole.
We don't have to. We want to. And that's the big difference. We enjoy getting together with our families during the holidays and having fun together. And I think with us, it's a little like a good marriage. On the one hand, everyone does a bit of their own thing, has their strengths and their own views about things, but we also spend a lot of time together. And what's different about Christian is the fact that there's always something planned. There's always some activity, sport. Lazing around, sitting around and doing nothing, that's just not an option.
We also share a love for a particular sport.
Polo?
A passion for playing polo, exactly.
I wonder why you started, Mr. Odia. Is it because you thought to yourself, well, if the boss plays polo?
No, to be honest, that was always a reason why I didn't start, as I thought I could only lose, which unfortunately turned out to be true later. I just started extremely late in life. I was extremely lacking in talent until I grasped how a horse ticks, how it moves forward, or how it begins to accelerate forward. That was a big challenge. Why did I start? In fact, I have to report that it was Christian who at some point in his typical way at his home in Mallorca just said to me, "Hey, jump up in the saddle on that horse." And it wasn't just me that got in the saddle, my son did too, was taken with it straight away. And since that day, our whole family has got the bug and all of us simply love playing polo. But that's still not enough to catch up and start beating Christian.
That's going to be difficult.
Yes.
Now, let's ask the other way around. Mr. Völkers, what do we need to know about Sven Odia?
Well, there's a lot to say about Sven Odia. He began his real estate business training with us at our Elbe office here in Hamburg at the age of 18 or 19.
Did you hire him for the position?
I was involved in the hiring process, and it became clear that he was very driven, and after a year he said, "What now? What's the next step in my career?"
After a year?
After a year.
At the age of 19?
At the age of 19. Just staying put in Blankenese and selling real estate, that can't have been everything. And he became the youngest applicant in the running for our first foreign license for Mallorca. In long discussions, he convinced the entire management team at Engel and Völkers that he wanted and was able to acquire a license himself in Andratx at that time. And so it came to pass, straight after his apprenticeship at age 21 or 22, that he packed up his car with computers and the first brochures, set off for Mallorca, and then proceeded to open and establish the first international Engel and Völkers office in Andratx.
So, in his early 20s?
20, yes. Although it has to be said that I had convinced everyone in the management team. The only one who actually said to me, "Oh, stay in Hamburg for a few more years and sell a few more houses first," was, I think, you, Christian.
Yes.
Initially, he was a bit skeptical as to whether it was the right step to take. I mean, let's face it, I was pretty young after all. But in the end, I was allowed to pack up my car and off I went.
Well, the thing was that we'd only just started out in the licensing business. Up until then, we'd only had our own offices. But then we introduced a franchise concept, and this was to be our first international venture. And as a licensor, you also have an obligation to the licensee in terms of a responsibility. And even though you're not directly responsible from a financial point of view, you still have to do everything you can to ensure that a license partner is successful. And of course, there were many unanswered questions. Firstly, due to his age, his lack of experience, and then because of the lack of support structure we had in place in Spain. It was certainly a daring undertaking. He was so convinced, though, that he wanted to do it, that we took the decision together in the management team and said, well, in that case, off you go.
And he obviously didn't do too badly.
Well, that was just it. He then did have a difficult time. The first few months were very complicated. You always need a little time before things get up and running. And if you're as restless as Mr. Odia, then it's harder during that period to wait until success comes along. But he then settled in unbelievably well and very, very quickly became our best license partner in the whole group. This prompted me to come back and resume very intensive discussions with him.
License partner means that he was no longer a permanent employee of yours. He was an independent entrepreneur, correct?
Yes, he was an independent entrepreneur. He was responsible for what he was doing. He was financially responsible for his activities. So he really was an independent entrepreneur at, believe it or not, 22, 23 years of age. So very, very young.
And it was the biggest challenge of all to find someone who, of course, is willing to give you the money to do it alone with your own business.
And you then feared that you'd be saying, wait a minute, not that he becomes too successful and at some point says he might not come back to Engel and Völkers at all.
No. Fortunately, that wasn't the case in the end. The fact is that successful license partners are the best thing that can happen to us. But of course, if you want to expand as rapidly as we do, you are always looking for good employees and for new employees who can contribute to the growth of the core business, not the head office. And because he became so incredibly successful, I approached him to ask whether he would consider returning to Hamburg to work with me on implementing the international expansion of the franchise concept.
And then, jumping ahead now, you made him, please correct me at any time if I get something wrong, you made him a shareholder in 2007, right?
Actually, I think it was already before that, because he'd already had a company, the licensing company, and he brought that back with him, didn't you? The company was merged with the Engel and Völkers company. So he then already had his first shares with the international business, not with the expansion of the franchise concept around the Mediterranean. And that turned out so well too that in the years that followed, he then traded these shares at some point for shares in the holding company, meaning he also became a shareholder of Engel and Völkers Holding and became a partner.
And then a few years ago he became co-CEO. Co-CEO sounds good. Why?
On the one hand, you can only make it that far if you're someone really outstanding. And Sven is one of those lucky finds we have in the company who is proficient across the entire spectrum of management, who has an extremely high social intelligence, who can talk to people, who has a superb ability to motivate people, to take people along with him on the journey, to bring people in alignment with the new things in the process and take them along. That was one of the big requirements. Of course, he also brought an enormous amount of experience with him. By then, he had almost 20 years of real estate experience, meaning that he also knows where every screw that makes a license partner needs to fit into place, how advertising and marketing work. So, in the end, he was a unique fit for the qualities required. And then, particularly when you reach my age and you've already done a lot, you also have the issue of what the future holds for the company. You have the question of succession, the question of how you can pass the baton on to another responsible managing director at a later point in time. And then we went down the route of becoming co-CEOs, which, interestingly enough, is a route rarely ventured down in the German economy.
Very rarely, exactly, yes.
It's actually hard for me to comprehend. Of course, you have to know there's a great deal of mutual trust involved in taking such a step. And there's also a great deal of discipline involved. Because when you're co-CEOs, you can't always be working on the same projects. You have to divide them up in a very clear-cut way. You then have to keep very strictly to the communication channels so that you don't get into a situation where conflicting opinions are being sent out into the company, which could then lead to confusion and chaos. And, of course, it takes a tremendous amount of trust. And we've had this now for, I think, 2 or 3 years.
For 3 years, I think. Exactly, yes, a little over 3 years.
And it has been a great process. Because on the one hand, it turned out to be a very, very good solution. And on the other hand, I was then in a position to withdraw from many things, which Sven then successively took over. And took over with huge success. And we now have a situation in which the entire operative business of property brokerage, of yachting and of...
They're aircraft too, right?
Exactly, aircraft brokerage. So practically the entire company with its 11,000 employees is managed and led solely by Sven Odia, and I have largely stepped down from this role.
That's interesting, because I've had my ear to the ground in Hamburg's business circles, and that's actually a point where people are saying, look, it's almost textbook how Mr. Völkers is managing his succession, isn't it?
Yes, and that wasn't a random process either, I would have said. To put it another way, we did plan this. We also called in external help. We received coaching with each other from external management companies, taking us through the processes. Not because we had problems, but because we wanted to optimize the processes. And that turned out to be the right move and a good move.
So is there now a kind of a timetable for a point where you say, okay, this is the moment where I'll step down completely from the company and then maybe just be...
We wanted to get specific about that here with you.
Yes, right. Let's do that. But Mr. Völkers still seems pretty fit to me. So I'd perhaps keep going to the end of this year.
No, this year we will, and I don't think we've discussed and announced this publicly yet, but I will be relinquishing this position as CEO or co-CEO this year. I will continue on after that in the company and continue to serve on the board. But Sven will be taking over the entire management of the company as sole CEO later this year.
Whoa.
And now we have that on tape.
Now we have that on tape. There's no rewinding that.
There's no rewinding that. And especially because, as I said, we're saying this for the first time right now in public. That is indeed news that we haven't, of course, made a decision about today. It was decided several weeks ago. And I think we both feel very, very comfortable. And, as I said, we have a great trial period behind us. One that went outstandingly well. And with this straightforward transition, it is indeed a fairy tale succession for me.
It's also a stroke of luck for you, because how many entrepreneurs are out there who say they can't do it? Those who can't manage this succession, among other things, because they can't let go, right?
That's something I just wanted to say. That's an important point. You have to be willing to let go. And you have to be willing not only to share responsibility, but also to hand over responsibility. And as I said, in this case, that is extremely easy for me, because we held this position together. And as I said, what Sven does is excellent. He does many things far better than me, and the company is in the best of hands with him.
Now, of course, a lot of people out there might be asking themselves, wait a minute, the company is called Engel and Völkers and not Odia and Völkers. We need to take a moment to look back. I didn't have any idea. I always thought the company was jointly founded by Dirk Engel and yourself. But in fact, Dirk Engel, your former friend and a fellow student, founded the company on his own to begin with, and then you went into partnership. And at a time that it's difficult now to imagine, when being an agent and real estate agent, be honest, you were probably laughed at by fellow students at the time.
Yes, certainly. It's true that the entire property industry at the time did have an extremely bad reputation. I mean, it still doesn't have a brilliant reputation, but a bit better than back then. But it had a very, very bad reputation. And the usual route you take growing up in Hamburg after a commercial apprenticeship is either in a private bank or in shipping, seafaring. And then when you finish your degree, you don't become a real estate broker. So in that respect, it was a very, very unusual move. So, yes, how did it come about? Dirk Engel was a friend of mine for many years. He had set up his own business with Engel & Company and was brokering foreign real estate with this company, which was based on Balindam. His intention was to sell large mansions in America to German investors. And that turned out to be relatively complicated and difficult. The business model was not straightforward, and confidence among German investors in American real estate was not particularly high either. At that same time, I'd been working for the Hamburger Wirtschaftsberatungsgesellschaft during my studies in business administration. That was just across the street from the Neue Jungfernstieg. And I'd been grappling there with American real estate bonds and funds, which I'd found rather boring and difficult. It didn't really excite me. And so Dirk Engel and I always used to meet up in between our respective offices on Jungfernstieg and thought about what we could do next, as things couldn't go on as they were. And then Dirk Engel took the step of finding this little villa where we started on the Elbchaussee, and then said, "You know, I'll give up on the American real estate. I'll go into really local business. I'm going to be an estate agent for the Elbe suburbs district here." And then he persuaded me to come on board a year or two later. I gave up my job at the Hamburger Geschäftsberatungsgesellschaft, continued on with my degree, and then joined him while I was still a student. Not as a partner at that point, first as an employee, as I wanted to get to know the business again. And it really was the case that I had to put up with a lot of surprise and disapproval from friends and family, as at that time the usual career path was either into the IT industry or to join one of the large consulting companies.
Or, if in doubt, join a private bank or similar.
Yes, or a private bank.
But presumably back then there were questions like, how do you intend to earn money with it?
No, I wasn't asked that. It was more a question of ethics, along the lines of, how can you go into such a profession? Of course, you shouldn't forget that this was a great opportunity, right? If an industry doesn't have a good reputation and you then go into this industry, you often have the advantage of working next to competition that isn't really that great.
That's true. What's it like nowadays, Mr. Odia? When you tell someone you're a broker, how do the people around you react?
Well, I know that when I was doing my exams in my final year of school, I thought long and hard about what I would do and was completely convinced that I'd go on to study law. And then there came a point when I said, somehow always just consuming knowledge, I want to actually do something. And then I sent out an application to Engel & Völkers and thought, well, it will either work or it won't. Of course, looking back now, it worked out.
You've applied for a job just once in your life.
I've applied once. I sent out a single application and wanted to receive a response. And then there was the interview. I put all my eggs in one basket. Otherwise, I would have gone down the path of studying law. But fortunately, it didn't turn out that way. But of course, I also had lots of people at the beginning who told me no. After finishing school, it's the right and proper time to start at university. But it was always clear to me that I wanted to do something that involved people. That wasn't just clear to me, but to everyone around me, including teachers and my parents, who always said, "Sven, you're not very talented musically nor athletically. We don't think you're much of a craftsman either. So do something with people." So it was clear to me, distribution, motivating people, bringing people together. That's why I wasn't actually that interested in what people around me were saying.
You don't have this problem anymore. Whenever you tell someone you're a realtor, most people must say, in that case you must be doing very well for yourself.
Most of them say, of course, it's incredible what has come about over the course of the last 40 years. Now there's a situation, of course, where people aren't just here in Hamburg. They see us in Spain and Italy and America, and they're always very impressed. They come up to you and say, "I was in New York last week and I spotted your shop there." That is, of course, what's very visible from an external perspective and what fascinates people. And the other thing they say, of course, we can look back on excellent years. We have really had a very fulfilling professional life in the last few years because we've made a big impact. And I don't think I'd trade it in for anything in the world. I'm still fascinated to this day by beautiful properties. I think it's a beautiful product. So for that reason, it was exactly the right decision.
What do you say to people who say, "Yes, you brokers, it's easy for you, it's kind of easy for you, you earn a lot of money from not much work"? An example, the other day a reader called and said, "It just can't be right. I just bought a house for 1.4 million. I didn't even set eyes on the real estate agent, but I had to wire over 86,000 euros to them nonetheless."
In that case, I can say for sure that they didn't buy with us at Engel Völkers.
No, true, he didn't.
With us, he would most definitely have seen the real estate agent. I think lots of people, both sellers and buyers, don't have any idea about the work and investment that's involved in offering a professional service. And it has to be said that everything that Christian wrote 40 years ago, the so-called Engel Völkers manual, where every single recurring action has been definitively documented and standardized, that we still live this out today. That is what every individual who carries an Engel Völkers business card is taught at the academy.
I had a little read of myself. It's interesting, as the classic thing is, if you've viewed a property, and I've been shown around many properties, yes, of course, it's always, or at least very often, finishes up in the boiler room in the basement. Except with Engel and Völkers, right? There's a clear rule. A viewing always ends in the living room, I think, correct?
In the nicest room.
That's often the living room, but it doesn't have to be. Some homes have a beautiful kitchen too, so it can end in the kitchen. But these are things we've really thought long and hard about, or that Christian thought for a long time about all those years ago.
And they all still apply.
Exactly, yes.
40 years, another example might be the bicycle stand in front of the shops, correct?
Yes, well, we could spend hours with you telling you about all the contents of this manual.
Dog ball, right?
Dog ball too, exactly. Of course, that's a little marketing gimmick.
But when I read, I thought, yes, you really do notice it.
You know, that's very interesting. I think a lot of license partners come to us because of the brand and the international network. But what they benefit most from is the strong system, because that's exactly what really hits home with the client, the way in which we go about brokering real estate, and that makes us absolutely unique.
Let's return to Dirk Engel, because that is in fact a sad story. You've told the story before, just so that everyone understands. Dirk Engel had severe depression. It's correct to say it was an affliction in the family. We know that, I think. There were several...
Yes, it was a family affliction. His father took his own life, and his grandfather took his own life. Back then, we had moved into this little villa on the Elbchaussee. We then sublet it to Erika Warburg. At the time, she was running a horticultural or garden design company, and Dirk Engel and myself sat in one room, and our secretaries sat in the other. But of course, this meant that I was very, very close to him on a daily basis, and I was very, very involved with the progression of this illness. And it's an illness that comes in waves, you know. There are hours, days, weeks when the illness is not so present, and then there were times when it was very, very difficult for him. And then, of course, he feared he would end up in the same situation as his father and grandfather, and unfortunately, that is what happened.
Of course, that was the moment for you, I think, too, when you took some time away, 3 months. I think the manual came about during that period, right?
Exactly. Dirk Engel was ultimately the front man. He did the business. He was out there dealing with the clients, and I was more the one who had been trying a bit in the background to build systems or think about marketing systems. And of course, I was then faced with a very difficult situation because his suicide came completely out of the blue. So there was no way to prepare either emotionally or economically for it. So at first it was like a walk through a deep ravine, as it were. And then came the big decision of what to do, either to continue on in real estate on the path Dirk Engel had set up, or to do something completely different. And that something different was to bring a systematic approach to the job of broker. And in order to do that, I went on a retreat to Mallorca for 3 months. We had a house there, I visited my parents there, and wrote the Engel and Völkers manual there. And the Engel and Völkers manual is, I call it an opus in inverted commas. It was written back then on a typewriter on many, many pages that described the standardized service of property brokerage and how to go about it in the best possible way. And this standard service or standardized service is still a central part of the Academy to this day. Everyone who works at our company is taken through it and is briefed over several days during a training course on how they can provide the best possible service to clients. This isn't just important for us when it comes to one-off business and the experience of an individual client. It also has a lot to do with brand communication, you know. A brand is communicated on the one hand through the box trees arranged in front of the shops, and the shop in itself as the face of the brand in the marketplace. But of course also very strongly through corporate identity and corporate behaviour. Corporate behaviour is ultimately the way in which the client approaches the shop, how they talk to the employee, and how the employee ultimately provides their service to the client. We set a milestone with this. There isn't anything else of its kind in the world. A standardized service like this that is then taught and implemented. And it remains the foundation stone of our success.
And another thing you didn't do, which you could have done, was call the company Völkers. It is still called Engel and Völkers. Why?
Well, Dirk Engel was the one who got things started, wasn't he? I didn't want to ignore that at the time, and I still don't want to. That's how it was. And secondly, he was a very, very close friend of mine, who, as I said, took the first initial steps with me. So there was no question for me.
What would he say if he came walking around the corner now and saw what Engel and Völkers has become?
Naturally, I've thought about this from time to time. It wouldn't have been his thing. He was quite clearly the charming practitioner and the Superman at the front. Duplicating such a role when you have such strong talents is very, very difficult. And that's why I think, or I know, he wouldn't have gone along down the route of our vast expansion. I came from a completely different angle and approached the business from a completely different side that would not have been his thing.
Although there's always one thing you have to understand, I think. Everyone has an idea of where things can go, but I think even the two of us could never have imagined at the beginning the sheer size that the company could grow to, and that it would become so international. If someone had asked me if I'd be confident enough to grow and develop a company that operates in so many countries, with so many management structures, I would have always said absolutely not. I'm good at an individual operation, as it were. I can motivate people. And I think it's something you warm to. And perhaps he would have gone along this same path and would have accompanied Dirk Engel down this same road. It's something that doesn't happen overnight, and I think it's always something of great interest too. So when you look back now, you say, it's incredible how big things became, when of course you're in the midst of the process, you only experience it step by step and can adjust to it somehow.
And unfortunately, step by step means not only forward, but sometimes back as well.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to that later. You just say one can't even imagine it. I mentioned at the beginning that there's also a huge misjudgment we came across on the part of Christian Völkers. Do you know what huge misjudgment that was?
Oh, I'm all ears.
So am I.
Think back to an interview with Focus magazine in 2010. Christian Völkers says about the real estate market in Germany in 2010 that Germany is a healthy market. If you're selling a property, you shouldn't expect any high gains, but you won't suffer any high losses either. At the time, didn't you see it coming, what happened in the years that followed? Because there were times, we have to tell those people who were growing up in the last 10 years, when each year brought a 10-20% jump. It really was like that. Real estate wasn't necessarily something where someone who had a great investment idea said, I'm going to do that now, you know.
Well, I would almost say what I said back then. I couldn't anticipate the future and didn't know what was going to happen. And we can't do that today either. But generally speaking, I would still sign off on that statement I made.
Really?
That the market in Germany is extremely stable and extremely reliable compared to many other markets when it comes to property price trends. Of course, we have some fluctuations from year to year, or perhaps every 1 or 2 years. But generally, if you look at the development of real estate prices over the last 20 years, the last 30 years, nobody who's invested in property has lost money in the long term.
Rather than lost, they've gained enormously. I could give you some examples right now of neighbors of mine who tell me with a glint in their eye, we bought the house 10 years ago for 600,000 euros and now I've sold it for 1.4 million euros. That's a development that you...
But it's also the first time, it must be said,
The first time, yes.
after the Second World War, that there was such a cycle where property prices rose so disproportionately in Germany. Well, that was always a source of amazement for us. We flew around the whole world and arrived in Madrid and Rome and heard about prices per square meter that we could only have dreamt of in Germany and Hamburg.
And what were the prices? 10,000, 12,000?
Oh, in some cases it was 25,000 euros the square meter. In good locations, very good locations in Madrid or Rome. And we always flew back and said, you can't be serious. A country like Germany with such economic power and real estate prices that just don't change? And then it's worth saying that 2010 was a very interesting year. I'll never forget the Christmas party of 2009 to 2010.
No, neither will I.
It felt as if there was no way forward. Christian gave a speech, and afterwards I thought, we're going to be shutting up shop entirely the next day. Because, of course, after that fourth quarter of 2009, where everything had come to a standstill in the world, so we had, for example, in Dubai, about 200 sales consultants. And in the third quarter, we had the best quarter ever. And in the fourth quarter, we had no turnover at all. So it felt as though the property market had suddenly come to a standstill. And the idea that this would be followed by such a party, as one could put it, where property prices would gallop off at such a pace, couldn't be foreseen. So I think in 2010, based on the knowledge you had at that point...
Right, that assessment isn't wrong at all, but when of course we now... Exactly, but if you look back, if you imagine that property prices in Hamburg have risen, I think, by almost 100% on average during this period. The other day, a Hamburg-based entrepreneur was saying that 10 years ago he'd bought a house on Bellevue for 1 million euros, perhaps a little exaggerated. Nowadays...
That's an exaggeration, I think.
Let's say on the Alster Lake. These days I might manage to find something on the Alsterlauf, but more in the region of 1.5 million, right?
Yes.
That's right. Of course, a great deal has happened in Germany, but we shouldn't forget either that there are other countries in Europe as well. If you look at Spain, for example, they had a completely different economic cycle between 2010 and 2014. Over there, property prices dropped drastically, particularly in the primary residence regions. The economy was in recession, so it's not like things happened the same everywhere like in Germany. We've had a very strong economic cycle here for 10 years now, but we've also seen other countries, and we see ourselves invested very, very heavily again in Spain in 2013, because we said that the situation will improve, that something will happen again, but that hasn't been the case everywhere in Europe. So Germany took on a very special role here very early on.
That's a nice thing to misjudge, isn't it? If I had said 8 years ago, let me think, I have a feeling, or Nobody buys newspapers digitally. I would have been pleased now that suddenly people actually are doing that, and now we have 33,000 digital subscribers, for instance. A misjudgment like that is something to be happy about, and that's also led you, I think, to it's called Marketing Commission, did I say that right? In other words, the turnover that you...
No, there's the Group Commission and then external revenues.
Group Commission, excuse me.
Right, that's it, because...
It's increased sevenfold, hasn't it?
Between then and now?
Compared to back then.
I've just looked it up. In 2009, we as a group generated $130 million in total commission revenues. And this year, we'll be making $800 million. So 2009 to the present, that doesn't feel like a long time. Yeah.
And that brings up the question, does this really have anything to do with the development of prices in Germany, or did it come about at your company as a result of acquisitions through other franchise partners?
Ultimately, our business is only driven to a very, very small extent by the development in sale prices. Our business is dependent on the overall transaction of properties that are being made in a country.
Due to the fact that luxury properties have always been expensive, haven't they?
No, due to the fact that our business model is different. Our business model is ultimately based on gaining market share from the total revenues that are being generated. And whether prices go up or down by 5% doesn't matter that much when it comes to the development of our group commission revenues. The development and growth of our company depends much more on being able to attract many employees and many other entrepreneurs to our company, and ensuring this way that our turnover increases.
You know, many people always see us here in Hamburg and say, "You really are very, very big here in Hamburg." The bottom line, though, is that we're now market leaders in Spain. We have the most offices there, and we have a very, very high market share in cities like Barcelona. We now have 1,500 people operating under the brand in Spain. So it's not just Hamburg or Germany. We have, of course, become very international. We're the only company that is strongly positioned in North America. We have 200 offices in the USA and Canada. Never before has a European company succeeded in gaining market share there.
How big is the German share of this revenue?
Well, of the 800 million, around 330 million will be generated this year in commission revenues in Germany, or in the DACH region of Germany, Austria and Switzerland, to be precise. And the rest will be generated from our international operations.
Let's come back to Hamburg for a moment. It's the headquarters after all. You have, I think, Mr. Völkers, 2 houses in total, one on Majorca, one in Hamburg.
That's right.
Right, and you, Mr. Odia, have also purchased a house.
A similar combination. Also one in Hamburg, not far away from Christian in Hamburg. And on Mallorca, our homes are around 90 minutes drive from one another.
Would you buy a house in Hamburg at the present time?
Yes.
Even at these prices?
Yes.
Okay, but for your own private use only, or as an investment property
Well,
too?
there are classic investment properties that are only really suitable as investment properties. And then there's the classic Hamburg mansion, where the issue of investment properties, or an acquisition for the purposes of investment, is not the focus. The typical buyer of a mansion buys it to live in it themselves. But of course, with the very charming side effect of living in a home that will have increased in value over the years.
And will continue to increase?
Well, as I said, looking ahead is complicated.
That's true.
But there's no reason at the moment to assume that this won't be the case.
But that's the interesting thing, too. No matter where you go, if you go to dinner or something, everyone asks you, of course.
Oh, of course.
The moment you sit down at the table, the first question that comes up is, "Sven, tell us, what's coming next?" The point is, Christian doesn't have a crystal ball, and I don't have a crystal ball either. Of course, we're completely fascinated by real estate, and if you were to ask me, I can't do anything else. I could only invest in real estate because that's the only thing that we know a little about.
But don't you sometimes flinch and say, wow, a 120% price rise in 10 years? Wow, there are many who say, well, even experts who say maybe it's healthy when you buy a property to need to pay the equivalent of 25 years of rent for it. But there are homes being sold in Hamburg for the equivalent of 52, 60 years of rental payments. And then there are several experts who think it's a property bubble that will burst one day in Hamburg.
Well, they're two different things.
2 different things, of course.
The first thing is the purchase of the property or mansion. And there is one thing to perhaps bear in mind here. Germany has grown very, very moderately compared to other countries. It has grown well, but it is moderate growth. Then there are places where a very, very high international demand is concentrated on a relatively local market. And when that happens, you see price explosions of completely different proportions. And then there really does come the point where you say this could now go into reverse gear. We don't see this danger in Germany. But this is quite possible in some cities that are very, very overheated in parts.
So not in Germany as a whole, but in Hamburg, for example, at the top end in certain regions where people say, okay, so if you buy a house today for 1.6, 1.7 million in Alsterdorf, which would have cost 500,000 10 years ago, then the probability that this price will keep rising to 2.5 million is probably relatively low, isn't it? That could also happen.
It could.
That's very difficult to answer.
Nothing is impossible.
The fact is that we currently find ourselves in a complete market economy regulation process. And that's a question of the quantitative development of supply and the quantitative development of demand. And specifically in Hamburg, we have a situation where demand is recruited very, very strongly from Hamburg residents. So the question is, what will happen to demand? Will it change? To me, there seems no reason why it would change. The probability is a lively level of demand will continue. Hamburg's population is growing, so in that sense, we have a stable demand situation. And in terms of supply, Hamburg residents are simply restrictive and like to hand down their properties to the next generation. They're not the type to jump from house to house. Rather, once a house has been acquired, it's the done thing that it should remain in the family for a long time.
Is that a problem at all? Other brokers report that that's the problem. On the one hand, it's good that the commission is rising with sale prices. On the other hand, the supply simply isn't that large at all because when a good house does come onto the market, it's off the market straight away again. Is that a problem for you?
Well, there's always a bottleneck. That has to be said. At the moment, it is of course a big challenge to acquire properties. There's an incredibly high demand. As Christian just said, it's always this interplay between supply and demand. And of course, we have a situation with regard to monetary policy at the moment that is resulting in this asset class of residential property being really en vogue in Germany for the first time, in fact. So for 10 years now, people thinking about investing are also turning their attention to residential investments.
Due to how the interest rates are.
Of course, it's a challenge at the moment to acquire properties. But what you were just asking about, whether it's unlikely that a house that costs 1.6 million now will cost 2 million in the future, clearly has something to do with demand. We don't have any influence on monetary policy. We're seeing that real estate is also a very emotional issue and has a huge advantage too. You simply don't have a price tag on it every day. When you buy a share and it goes down 30%, you feel poor straight away. This kind of transparency doesn't apply with properties, and that is a much more emotional issue. That's why I'm a great advocate of investing in bricks and mortar, and I also believe that this can be a very, very good investment in the future.
We'll get to the emotional point in a moment because it really is very emotional deciding whether you buy a house or not. And once you've found the right house, I think then you just buy it without thinking in that moment what it might be worth 2 years down the line. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Other brokers, I don't know what it's like for you, say that one problem they have with sellers is that some sellers can't ever get enough. They see this price trend and then they slap another 500,000 euros on top. What's your experience of this been like? Do you sometimes have to stop sellers in their tracks and tell them they'll get a high price, but in the end it has to be realistic?
Well, you have to look at it this way. The rising prices are being brought about by sellers because it's the sellers who usually anticipate the market, at least with their expectations. And it's then the job of the respective broker to talk to the sellers and point out to them where the market price is at that time. This sometimes means that high expectations have to be brought back down to earth a little. But usually this also results in a house being sold in a normal time frame, meaning the seller doesn't have to wait as long before a buyer comes along. So, a realistic market valuation is extremely important when it comes to successfully selling a property.
How difficult is it when you're stood with a buyer like that? The seller is stood there and he says 2 million, but as a broker you know you won't get more than 1.3.
That's a complicated thing to handle, just as Sven said. The price isn't automatically saved somewhere. On the stock exchange, you can't disregard it. But in their own mind, in the seller's consciousness, they have a share in the assets of their property. And if their feeling has firmly equated price X to this share, and then you're faced with the task of convincing them that the price isn't realistic, you're getting involved in their personal finances and have to correct them. And discussions like these aren't easy. It requires a lot of market insight, a lot of empathy with the client, and of course, taking on a lot of responsibility.
And you always have to remember one thing too. It's very subjective. To begin with, every seller wants to achieve the highest sale price, and every seller will tell you how beautiful their house is and will say, you know, my neighbor 3 doors down, he sold for price X 3 years ago, but my garden is much, much nicer, so I have to top that price. So presenting arguments that go against this and telling them that what the actual market price is, such talks sometimes break down due to the subjective demands of the seller. Because they're quite clear, I'm in a position to claim that this house is worth this and that's really something where you have to be very, very well qualified and lead someone towards what the market price is. Because what can also happen if their asking price is too high is that they can end up scaring off clients, so to speak, who are actually interested in the property. And when that happens, a property can really go into a descent, for want of a better phrase. It may end up being sold for less than the going market rate, as it wasn't priced in well in the first place.
So as a result it will be on the market too long, no? Then there are houses where you think there's something not quite right there.
It gets damaged by the time it spends on the market.
So ideally you have a house and it gets sold relatively quickly.
Ideally. Well, every seller wants to secure the highest possible price and sell as quickly as possible. But the ideal scenario is if they take our advice on board too, we say we think this and that is the right market price, and then we put it up for sale and achieve that market price.
Because I think as a seller, I haven't sold a house before, but of course you always think the real estate agent won't just suggest any old sale price, because the agent also has an interest in the sale price being as high as possible.
Last year, we brokered real estate worth 20 billion euros worldwide. So we already know a great deal about the real estate market. And in the markets where we operate, which we're specialized in, we can say with a very, very high level of certainty where we see the valuation of their property.
Do you sometimes turn down the chance to sell a property?
Yes, of course.
Sure.
Yes?
Yes.
Because you think there's no way to meet in the middle?
No, because sometimes the seller's demands are too high. We say we don't see things their way, and then it doesn't make sense to start brokering.
That's another issue of responsibility, you know. Taking responsibility for an overinflated price where you already know that you're endangering the property. We don't go down that route.
When do things start to get critical? If it's been on the market for 6 months or a year?
A property should be sold faster, in today's market climate, faster than in half a year. At least in first home markets. If that isn't the case, then it's reasonable to assume that the sale price was too high.
Then you have to go down. There are these wonderful wordings like new price, and then you think, oh, perhaps there's still a hope there after all. So this is the development that you infect then?
That's the hope of the buyer, to then say, oh, maybe I could enter a bid for a different price and maybe we can still come to an agreement. But as you said yourself, at the moment, the seller is in the driving seat because there's a high demand. And then some sellers say to themselves, no, if I don't get the price I'm asking for, then I'll wait a little longer until someone comes along and submits an offer at that price.
Let's also speak about holiday properties. Is there at least any good news on Sylt? Is it possible to say on Sylt it's like this or that?
Well, Sylt has had 2 wonderful summers to begin with.
1 million more overnight stays than usual.
It's true to say that already helps a great, great deal.
So I'm wrong in thinking that somehow a lot of people on Sylt are suddenly selling up?
No, Sylt is just like Mallorca or other second home markets. It's also characterized by the fact that it's a second home market, and of course, owner retention is always lower than with first home markets. You know, when it comes to first homes, it's important. That's where my children first went to school. This is where I live with my family. With second home markets, there's actually this latent sense that practically every house is up for sale if an offer is made at the right price.
I always wonder why anyone should sell up at the present time. We recently had a discussion about how those who are glad that prices have gone up so much say, yes, well, but if I sell my house now, then I'll get pretty much the same house for that price. Or I can put my money in the bank with negative interest.
It's worth saying here that properties used for first home purposes are also subject to people's life cycle. In other words, for what reasons does someone decide to sell their primary residence? Either the house is too big or it's too small, or someone has passed away, or someone has to relocate and move from A to B.
But these are biological, natural, these are probably the main reasons, right?
They're the main reasons. And I'd say in classic first home markets, these account for 95% of the reasons why someone decides to sell. It's very rare that someone approaches us and says they want to take advantage of the appreciation in value, and that's why they want to sell their house in order to then relocate to a rental property. It doesn't make any sense for someone to sell their home somewhere where they then always need to buy a new one. You then have the same market conditions. You can then perhaps speculate that you'll get a very, very high amount for your house and then get lucky when buying in order for it to be worthwhile.
What we often see, of course, is that people come with ideas, especially in second home markets, saying they absolutely want to be directly on the coast. Okay, well, there's nothing nicer than being in the first row of houses by the sea. After a year and a half, they say, oh, the sea, it's a bit dark at night. I'd like to see some lights. So then the next stop is the second row of homes where the lights can be seen. And that's a bit like with yachting too. You start with a little house, then it has to get a little bit bigger. That's what we experience. There's a constant shift, a constant change to it. And of course, that's also something that's good for us. But especially when it comes to second homes, we're seeing that people start looking again for something bigger after just 3 or 4 years.
Change. People's demands change. Can you explain very briefly why brokerage commission fees differ so greatly? 6.25% in Hamburg and 3.25% in Schleswig-Holstein, the German federal state just next door to Hamburg.
It's based on a recommendation of what's typical for the local region. And you always have to take into account that there's an internal and external commission. So, if you compare 3.25 to 6%, then you're talking about the so-called interior commission. But there might be an external commission too. So in Germany, it's usually the case, or always the case, that up to 6% commission is charged.
So people in Schleswig-Holstein region are lucky.
It depends what side of the fence you're on.
Exactly. And then there's been a very long political discussion about this. And now there's been a political agreement to share this in the future, that there are internal and external commissions, that on the one hand, the seller will pay part of the commission as the buyer will do too.
And the positive outcome is that this will now be regulated beyond the Federal Republic of Germany, and that ultimately we won't have any different commission fees in different federal states in future.
Oh, when will that be?
These are the first verbal statements that have now been made in the discussion. And, as I said, the very, very sensible dividing up of commission between the buyer and seller too.
But then the tendency in Hamburg will be that it will go down as it will be adjusted.
No, here in Hamburg, we have a situation where the buyer currently pays the commission fee, and that will be divided up between the seller and buyer in the future.
Seller and buyer. Okay.
Then the seller may ultimately price in this commission as well.
Exactly. Yes, good. Sure. That's clear.
That means the total amount that has to be paid on this transaction may remain the same.
We are gradually coming to an end, don't worry. But we have to talk about that emotional aspect again first, though. I have to out myself now as someone who rents their home. My wife and I were recently wondering why we're still tenants and haven't bought a house. And it is indeed the case, and it's stupid that many people say it's stupid that you didn't take advantage of that whole development in prices. We haven't found the right house, and now I think I've done everything right.
But who are you looking with in that case?
Well, we had them all. I think we've been with Engel and Völkers already too. I think I read somewhere when you bought it on Mallorca, Mr. Völkers, you said, "This is mine. I have to have it," right? You didn't spend time looking around or anything, something like that.
No, I very, very much... Oh, I see. I didn't look at the property afterwards.
No, exactly. That's what I mean.
I looked at the whole market beforehand in great detail and looked at all the possible options. But then I saw this property and said that I simply had to buy it there and then.
And that's my question. If you don't have the feeling, wow, that's it, then you shouldn't buy it, right? If you are saying something along the lines of, yes, it's actually quite nice, but...
The question is a little bit whether it's a purchase out of necessity, because you really need somewhere to live, for the reasons I was talking about before, or whether it's more of a purchase purely for pleasure.
Purchasing for pleasure seems like a better idea, right?
Yes, it is better in the sense that you ultimately aren't faced with the same level of pressure, you know. This is typically the case when buying a second home in a holiday region. You go there when the sun's shining and you've had a nice holiday. Then you decide you'd like to buy a house there after that holiday. That is then a real purchase for pleasure, as you're completely taken with the area, with the house, with the location. And it's nice, of course, if you have the same when buying your first home, where the need is sometimes greater, that you really need to buy something. That this pleasure element then comes into the equation, and you really find enjoyment in the property.
Is it stupid of someone to be a tenant?
Well, you have to take into account that the majority of the population in Germany are tenants. We have the second lowest ownership quota in Europe.
And the highest saving rate, right?
The highest savings rate.
The money is there, but people...
But still, we have over 60% of the population who rent their home. And so the question is, what's the right path to take? I think that always depends on the life cycle too, and what you say about having to find the right home. Of course, if you sit down with us, we would always tell you that the location is the most important thing, and that you can change everything else optically. You have to have a bit of imagination, and you have to find the right craftsman, but then you'll be able to make it just the way you like it. So I think we are two very, very big advocates of owning a property, of course, if it's possible. And personally, I've always, for me, a career and earning money was always a great motivation to living in a beautiful home. For me, it was always the most important thing.
If you were a politician, you'd have a big problem, namely these rising property prices. Do you have an idea what you'd do about it?
I think what's being discussed at the moment only makes sense to a certain point, because in the end, if you want rents to stay at the current level, or even tend to decrease, then you simply have to build more. And I think anyone who comes up with good proposals on how to get more building land designated and how we can build at cheaper rates, if they look to our neighbors in Holland, there is one building regulation. We have a different building regulation for each federal state. Implementing anything at all results in such high costs, and politicians have to get to grips with such issues. I think we simply have to tackle the issue at the root and decide how we're going to go about creating more homes.
Although there's a lot of building work going on in Hamburg, right? Or isn't there?
Yes, but not enough.
Still not enough?
Not enough. Not enough. It's a purely quantitative problem, isn't it? And with this quantitative problem, being able to take control, or thinking that you can take control by intervening in the market economy, might perhaps fix the problem in the short term, but it's not a solution for the long term.
And as you said yourself at the beginning, there are lots of people who want to invest in real estate. So there are plenty of people who'd be willing to invest in property. You just have to change the overall situation, in my opinion, so that there really is more building land available and so that investing in housing becomes attractive again.
Now, we're all fans of Hamburg. We love this city. I find every year I think to myself, yes, there's a lot of building work. Things get built fast, but it's not as chic as it used to be. They are basically just buildings, these classic town halls. You ask yourself, is there still such a thing as roofers? Because it seems there aren't any roofs on any new buildings anymore. And lots of buildings look the same. And I sometimes ask myself, in 100 years' time, people will be saying, I'm moving into a historic old building, and that old building will be what's being built right now. Don't you also find yourself thinking, oh, Hamburg is changing relatively quickly, new apartments and houses are popping up, but none of it looking particularly appealing?
Yes, sometimes I feel that way too. And of course, this applies in particular to areas with major new developments, where construction methods are different to those used 100 years ago around the Ulster Lake. But there are, of course, economic considerations. The ceiling heights we used to have, the plaster facades, the stucco decoration, the slate roofs. All of these are things that can no longer be realized in the same way economically nowadays. And the entire cityscape is changing as a result. And you sometimes feel as though these are all such practical standard buildings that have sprung up. And in 50 years, we will certainly look back to this time and say that we built it this way and that way, and those were the reasons for it. But building differently on a large scale today isn't economically viable.
It doesn't work.
But at the same time, I think we're lucky, very lucky to live in this city. It's a beautiful city. There are so many beautiful residential areas in Hamburg. I couldn't list many cities in the world where I could say there is as much quality of life as in Hamburg. So I'm always happy when the time comes to return to Hamburg from abroad, because I really think it's such a good city to live in. And that's because we also have such beautiful existing houses and buildings, because we have such great residential neighborhoods.
Nevertheless, you have, as a colleague was saying the other day, where I thought, wow, I was talking to him on a bike ride with him, and then I said, where exactly do you live in Eimsbüttel? And then he said, where for the time being at least. And then I said, why do you say that? Well, we have an incremental rental contract. We can afford it for another 2 years and then we'll have to leave. And that, of course, results in a kind of basic aggression in people. I don't know if you catch word of it, where people say, I love this city. I think this city is great, but unfortunately I can't afford it anymore. And we often talk to doctors, to senior physicians who say, yes, it would be nice if I could afford to live close to the city hospital, but I just can't afford it. And that's a problem, of course.
That's a pity. That's sad, it's true. I agree with you. Especially because, of course, this also leads to a cultural shift in the city's districts, doesn't it? And that really is regrettable.
Is there any way we can manage this leap across the River Elbe? What experience have you had with luxury real estate south of the Elbe? Is there any demand?
The first step now is the Hafen City, where luxury properties have been built and where luxury properties have also been sold. But the heterogeneous makeup of the Hafen City district means that luxury property there won't become firmly established, you know. The typical buyer of a property in the Hafen City is not someone who has previously lived on the Ulster Lake or in the Elbe suburbs. It's more likely to be a buyer from outside or a young buyer who wants something different. So we're opening another chapter for urban development with the Hafen City. Many years ago, we suggested building a bridge from the Hafen City to the south. It was to be built in conjunction with a skyscraper. Neither were approved at that time. We had a great model, which we brought along with us to the town hall and presented. Now, a similar skyscraper is to be built further to the east.
Probably much higher than your tower, right?
A little further away from the centre of the Hafen City and the Elbe crossing at this point is relatively far away from the city centre. In this respect, I think it would be difficult to establish this as a new residential location in the south, to establish residential construction there.
Well, I have to out myself now.
Now I'm all ears.
Even though I know it won't go down well with everyone, I think it's just a huge missed opportunity that we didn't bring the Olympic Games to Hamburg.
Absolutely.
I think it would have been a huge chance for this city to make the jump across the River Elbe. If you look at what was planned there and how these quarters would have been revived and how the concept in place was to continue after the Games to ensure that life or attractive living quarters were not only created there, but that people would live there, work there, pursue leisure activities, I think it was, or is, a huge missed opportunity. And I think it's very regrettable. Don't reopen that old wound. Terrible.
Yes, terrible. Somehow we agree on that. But it was something like 1.5% of Hamburg's population who disagreed. I still have to ask 2 questions before you
Depart hence.
The first question is, I found quite interesting. Engel and Völkers' new headquarters, not so new anymore, but in the Hafen City. And you think, of course, they bought it, but they didn't. They are tenants in their own headquarters, right? Or has that changed? You built it, that's right?
Well, what usually happens and what makes commercial sense, we acquired the land, we acquired the building rights there. We then held the architectural competition and discussed the overall concept with the construction company on how to build it. And then we worked with a partner to realise construction of the property. And then, of course, the question arises when there are interested parties, insurance companies or large institutional investors who are now prepared to pay a lot of money for a property, whether this typical case of sale and leaseback could be an option. And that's what we did. We had a very, very lucrative offer. We were also able to realise the profits we had on our books there, and are now tied to the site with a very, very long-term lease, and have sold the property to an insurance company, which was definitely the right economic and commercial decision.
And of course, one thing has to be said. There is no stopping Engel and Völkers where it stands today. We have to invest. We have to ensure that we continue to grow in the future, that we are competitive, that we take on board things like digitization properly, that we make a lot of money available for this. And you can't always have both. On the one hand, you can't say, I own this beautiful building here in the Hafen City, which really is a great building where everyone feels very at home, but we made the decision. We want to continue to grow. We want to make major investments in the near future. And for that, we also need money. And that's why at some point, this was also a very economically driven consideration.
The very last question, an insider's tip. Hamburg, real estate. Not the classics, but a real insider's tip. District, region.
Oh, I think there are districts like Rotenburgsort that perhaps aren't that popular right now. But when you see how the Hafen City is developing, I can imagine that in 5 and 10 years' time, the whole aspect of leisure links to the Hafen City and to the city as a whole, that districts like this will benefit greatly.
Well, there's one thing you shouldn't forget, or rather, you have to keep reminding yourself, that Hamburg is the city with the most bridges in Europe. And it has the most bridges because we have many waterways. And some of the land adjoining these waterways isn't developed yet, as we have large warehouses, logistics areas, and factory buildings there. If I were to invest today, and I was to go looking for good locations, if I were also a bit of a long-term investor, then I really would look at the waterways in Hamburg and consider where the potential is, where one can invest, where it's possible too to think about a longer-term rededication of building rights from logistics to housing, from office space to housing. I think there is still dormant potential there and price increases that can be quite exciting.
Thank you very much. I had a hunch that it would be interesting, but that it would be so interesting with a spectacular announcement that you hopefully won't tell others before the release. Nobody could have guessed that. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much.